Um, Boy, I tell you, I've really thrown myself into this project since the pandemic. I kind of worked on it peripheral with the life of Jim Bates, a combat photographer, and Adele Obadov. We helped produce a documentary on her. And then in 2019, a book came out called Spearhead by Adam Makos, who's a New York Times bestselling author. And they came to the Pikes Peak Library District to give a print in memory of Jim Bates, who was a combat photographer who filmed this incredible battle during the Battle of Cologne at the footsteps of the Cologne Cathedral between an American tank, a T-26 tank, Pershing tank, a new tank at the time, and a German Panther tank. Very dramatic film footage that I'm going to show you. Well, Adam Makos wrote this book called Spearhead, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But he brought the gunner who actually shot the fatal bullets into the German tank, and his name was Clarence Moyer. He's in his 90s. And Jim and Clarence became friends after we did the documentary on Jim Bates. But I read the book, and he talked about General Rose. It wasn't a book on General Rose, but he was one of the characters he talked about. And it's this incredible connection to Denver and Colorado. And hardly anybody has heard of him because he was killed in action on March 30th, 1945. But anyway, I've written a book about my career working in libraries called There's No Such Thing as a Typical Librarian. And it's available for sale on Amazon. And also you can see my email up there. If you have any questions you want to email me about, certainly send me an email at anton1492@gmail.com. But the cover of the book you'll see is a picture of the Carnegie Library, downtown library. And the Carnegie Library houses the special collections for the Pikes Peak Library District. And it's a remarkable collection. One thing I tell everybody is that because Colorado Springs is such a beautiful city, it's always attracted some of the best photographers and filmmakers to the region. And we have this incredible collection at the library. Brett Labello is the head of the collections now. And at better times, I don't know what the restrictions are to go into it now. They may have opened it up a little bit. But this collection is also online. They have a digital archive. And many of the films and photographs I'm going to talk about and show you today are in the digital archives. And many of the films are on YouTube. But like I said, the photographers started shooting photos of Colorado Springs since 1871. And actually, the first film that was made in Colorado Springs was 1897. It was the Edison Company. They kind of came by, they wanted to film the Wild West. So they shot a short film on cattle fording a stream and calves being branded. But what happened with the film collection, where it really exploded, was in 1928 when the Alexander Film Company moved to Colorado Springs. They produced what they called at the time advertising playlets for movie theaters. This is commercials that were shown in movie theaters. They came up with a concept in 1919 in Spokane, Washington. And of course, if you go to a movie theater today, you can't avoid seeing a commercial. But they came up with this concept. You have to understand, this is even before television commercials. So they developed the concept of selling commercials during films, and then eventually they got into television commercials. But they're a very successful company. At the time, they wanted to do this on a national basis. And this was before overnight package delivery and long distance phone calls. So the best way for them to do this was to transfer or move their company to the center of the United States. So they moved their company, I think it was in 1926, to Denver, Colorado, to Englewood, Colorado. And then they also wanted to use planes to help deliver their films to the customers. They figured, well, this would be a way to promptly deliver our product to the different theaters across the country. And J. Don Alexander and his brother Don M. Alexander, J. Don had been a pilot. And so they investigated purchasing planes. And there wasn't a biplane that they really liked, and Don M was an engineer, he was an electrical engineer, so they decided to design their own biplane, the Alexander Eagle Rock, which at the time was the most popular biplane. They sold about 1,500 of them. Not only did they use them, but they were able to sell the planes. And there's one in DIA. If you go to the United terminal, you'll see one of the Alexander Eagle Rocks hanging from the ceiling. But anyway, I have another presentation I give on the Alexander Film Company, and I'll do that again for the Pillar Institute. By the way, I want to thank Vicki Hefner for allowing me to do this and helping with this project today. But I'll talk in a future program about the Alexander Film Company. And I hope in the summer to do a program on the historic films of the Pikes Peak region. But this photo was shot by Jim Bates of General Rose at the foot of the Cologne Cathedral. And Jim Bates worked for the Alexander Film Company. He started right out of high school, out of Colorado Springs High School. I think he graduated in 1936. And they hired him. The Alexander Film Company at one point had 600 employees in Colorado Springs. They were the largest theatrical advertising company in the world. So Jim was trained as a cinematographer. So when World War II started, he joined the Army. And because of his background working with film, they put him into the Signal Corps. And they trained 60 of these combat photographers. And he was one of them that was sent to Europe. And he had a remarkable year as a combat photographer. In 1994, I did a documentary on Jim called Scenes of War, which is on YouTube. And he talks about his career, and he talks about his career with the Alexander Film Company. But he jumped at D-1. The 82nd Airborne wanted to have a combat photographer with them when they jumped at D-Day, which actually D-1 the evening before. And they jumped behind the lines, and he almost drowned the first day that he jumped because of the Germans had flooded some of the area so that it prevented an invasion. And several of the 82nd Airborne actually did drown. And Jim said he went into the water. He said he thought he took his last breath. Here he was, the first minutes he was part of the invasion, he thought he was going to die. And then a breeze came up, caught his parachute, and pulled him over to the shore. And he was able to survive. All his equipment was ruined. And so they gave him a gun, and he was with the 82nd Airborne and shot it out until he could get to the Normandy beach and be resupplied. But for most of his time as a combat photographer, he spent following the 3rd Armored Division. And the 3rd Armored Division was headed up by General Maurice Rose from Denver, Colorado. And he was 44 years old when he died on March 30th, 1945. And this photo was taken the day after the Battle of Cologne in front of the Cologne Cathedral on March 8th, 1945. So just a few weeks before he died. But you can see in his eyes, it's almost a premonition that he wouldn't survive the war. And again, he was just focused from the moment he landed in Tunisia, North Africa, December of 1942, until his death near Paderborn, Germany on March 30th, 1945. He was focused on defeating Nazi Germany. And he had several chips on his shoulder, and I'll talk a little bit about him, but he was known as the front lines general. In fact, his troops weren't surprised that he was killed in action because he was always fighting from the front. He risked his life. He probably escaped death at least a dozen times before the fateful day of March 30th. But he was the highest ranking Jewish officer in the Army. And he was very private. He didn't share that with anybody. In fact, his commanding officer didn't know that he was Jewish. And when he died, when he was killed in action, they buried him 2 days later in Ittenbach, Germany. They put a Christian cross on his grave. But he was Jewish, very Jewish. Both of his parents were Jewish. They're immigrants from Poland. In fact, he was the son and grandson of rabbis. And his first language was Yiddish. He grew up in his home in Denver speaking Yiddish. But you could just see that the weary face, his weary eyes, because for the last 2.5 years he'd been planning and planning battles and had been in battles in the front lines for 2.5 years before his death. but just a remarkable man. I mean, he knew at the time, and I think one of the reasons why he didn't reveal the fact that he was Jewish is that it just wouldn't help at that point. Obviously, the Jews were being persecuted in Europe at the time, but even in the United States, there were restricted hotels. I think the Broadmoor Hotel was restricted. You couldn't go there if you were Jewish or Black. There are several clubs that were restricted that you couldn't join, and it just didn't benefit him as a soldier. And he was a soldier. He was a professional soldier to reveal his religion. But he knew he was Jewish. He obviously knew he was Jewish, and that was part of his motivation. And he was also very aware of the persecution of the European Jews. At that point, they didn't really know about the genocide, but they certainly knew about the persecution from Kristallnacht, from everything that went on leading up to the Olympics, that things were horrible in Europe if you were Jewish, for many of the families in Europe trying to escape to the United States. So if you were Jewish in the United States, you probably had relatives in Europe, and you either communicated with them or helped them leave Germany to come to the United States, and you knew very well what was going on. And the other chip on his shoulder is he was in an army filled with West Point graduates, people that had, several generations of family that had gone to West Point. And of course, he was an immigrant. There was no tradition of military serving in the United States military in his family. And he actually was a high school dropout. Hard to believe that one of the finest generals in World War II was a high school dropout. He went to Denver East High School. And I didn't know this. One of the books I'm going to talk about by Marshall Fogel from Denver is on General Rose. And in the book, he has his high school transcript at Denver East High School. And he struggled in school for whatever reason. Even though he had a photographic memory, he struggled in school. But he was a D and C student, and his transcripts just go through the 10th grade. He dropped out of high school when he was 16 years old. So there were several things that he kept to himself. I'm sure he didn't tell too many people he was a high school dropout. But what a remarkable story, considering how far he advanced in his career, and certainly how effective he was as a combat general. And this is one of my favorite pictures of General Rose. I'll go into it in a little more detail, but you will not see hardly any photographs of General Rose with a smile on his face. He always had that very stern, focused expression. I think it was part of who he was, his nature, but I think it was because he was focused on his task of defeating Nazi Germany. And all he wanted to do was defeat the Nazis and to return home to his family. Because he had a second marriage to Virginia Beringer, his wife, and he had a 2-year-old son when he left to North Africa. And all his desire was just to finish this war so he could get back home to his family, which unfortunately he never was able to do. But several things you'll see about this. He's a good-looking man, very handsome man, tall, athletic. He had been part of the cavalry, and he loved horses. He played polo, was in great shape. You can see very erect, good posture, but a very stern, focused look on his face. And he had his Camel cigarette in his hand. He was addicted to cigarettes. He was a chain smoker. He did not drink alcohol. And unlike Patton, he didn't swear. He did not swear at all. He didn't yell at his troops, but he demanded everything he could from them. He wouldn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And very organized. He had a photographic memory. And you can see with this desk, the in basket is empty. It just tells you that he was someone that was just focused on his task, ending the war. And unfortunately, he didn't make it to the very end. But what he accomplished in those 2.5 years is quite remarkable. But he originally was born in Middleton, Connecticut on November 26, 1899. And this is his best friend, Major General Elwood P. Quesada. And they had several things in common. P. Quesada was the son of immigrants. He was the highest ranking Hispanic officer in the Army, and he was the commander of the 9th Tactical Air Force. In fact, he's considered the father of tactical air support. He and General Rose, when they went to school together at the command school in Leavenworth, Kansas, Command College, they both kind of clicked together because they had similar backgrounds. They weren't West Point graduates, and the school was filled with West Point graduates. And of course, Quesada was Hispanic. He had a chip on his shoulder because he was Hispanic. But they managed to both be promoted to general because they were so good at what they did. They were just incredible officers. And Pete Quesada, even at the age of 38, he was promoted to brigadier general. They're both handsome men, both tall, athletic, handsome men. But the big difference is General Rose never smiled. Pete Quesada always had a smile on his face, this gregarious smile. But don't let that smile fool you, because he was tough. He was definitely tough on his men, and he demanded a lot. And like General Rose, he was a front lines officer or pilot. He flew on 90 combat missions. He didn't have to fly on any because he was a general. He commanded the 9th Tactical Air Force. But because he wanted to lead from the front, just like General Rose, and he had this chip on his shoulder, he had to prove himself worthy of commanding people who were West Point graduates, because many of the people that worked for them were West Point graduates. He got in the middle of the battle and flew 90 combat missions. But I'm a librarian, and there are several books written about General Rose and one book written about General Quesada that I'm going to talk about, if you're interested in pursuing it. This is Major General Maurice Rose, World War II's greatest forgotten commander. It's by Stephen Assad and Don R. Marsh. Now, Don R. Marsh served with General Rose. In fact, he's still alive. As far as I know, he's still alive. I think he's 98 years old. But Stephen Assad's about my age, maybe a little bit older. But he's a historian. And it's an academic book. It's not like Spearhead, which is more, it's like a Stephen Ambrose storyteller book. This is an academic book. If you're interested in detailed footnotes and everything that happened in General Rose's life, this is a very good book to read. And it's written with love. It really is, particularly Don's input, because he served under him. This was published in 2003. So it was written at a time when many of the men that served for General Rose were still alive. So they do have many firsthand accounts in the book. But it's an excellent book. I definitely recommend it. I recommend all these books I'm going to talk about today. This is the only book written about General Pete Quesada. It's called Overlord, General Pete Quesada and the Triumph of Tactical Air Power in World War II by Thomas Alexander Hughes. And he was the father of modern tactical air power. They designed this, working with General Rose. Back then, they experimented with wireless communications. They put pilots in the tanks that could communicate with the pilots above ground, the P-47s with their 500-pound bombs. And they coordinated the battle. The truth of the matter is the Americans had inferior tanks to the Germans. They had what was called the Sherman tank. I know it sounds confusing, the Sherman tank, but it was named after William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general. And it was okay. Initially, the tank could compete a little bit in Africa, but once the Germans built the Tiger tank and the Panther tank, the American tanks could not compete with the German tanks. So the way that they were successful in battle was by coordinating their attacks with the Tactical Air Force that Pete Quesada headed up, the 9th Tactical Air Force. And they destroyed a lot of tanks with their 500-pound bombs. So most of the Tiger tanks and Panther tanks early on were destroyed by airplanes, the P-47s and the close air support. But this is a good book. This doesn't talk a lot about his personal life, but it does talk about his military life. And this is the book that I think is the most readable of all of them. It's called Spearhead. It's by Adam Makos. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He actually has companies out of Denver, but he's an excellent writer. He's a great storyteller. He's the Stephen Ambrose of his generation. I mean, he can really tell a story. And in this book, he tells the story of the people, and he focuses on Clarence Smoyer. Now, Clarence Smoyer was the gunner on this new American tank at the time. It was a T-46 called the Pershing tank. And he's seated on top of the tank. You can see him there. He's the only guy without a helmet. He had curly blonde hair. And I think that was his one vanity. He hated covering up his hair and wearing a helmet. He had this beautiful Liberace hair. But he He was a sharpshooter when it came to using the gun on the T-46. And in the battle sequence, I'll show you, it all ties together. Jim Bates from Colorado Springs, General Rose from Denver, and then Clarence Smoyer. Jim Bates filmed this remarkable tank battle that I'll show you a little later on. But this is the crew of the T-46, and Adam goes into the story, a detailed story on all the crew members leading up to the Battle of Cologne and what happened after that. And I really highly recommend this. This is on Audible, very professional, very well done, and is a great read. Or if you want to listen to it, it's a great listen. And he really does tell a good story. Now, this is a book, this is the most recent book that came out. It's a local man from Denver, respected Denver attorney, and it's called Major General Maurice Rose, the most decorated battle tank commander in U.S. military history. And his name is Marshall Fogel. And I don't think there's anybody in the country that is more dedicated to promoting the memory and heroics of General Rose than Marshall Fogel. In fact, he's behind the statue that's going to be put into Veterans Park. They're going to put a statue in Veterans Park across from the Capitol, probably in the next couple of years. In fact, they're raising the money for it through the Rose Community Foundation. If you're interested, you can go online on the Rose Community Foundation and donate for the statue. But they've got approval to put it up there, and I think it's scheduled for 2022. But this is actually a 500-page book. It's a massive book, but it's really worth purchasing because Marshall Fogel is a real collector. He collected every photograph. Like I said, he has General Rose's high school transcripts, everything you could possibly want to know about General Rose is in this book, every photograph, every personal photograph. And he really did spend almost 8 years writing this book, and he's been promoting the life of General Rose ever since. And this is a mock-up, a clay mock-up of the sculpture that's going to go into Veterans Park right across from the Capitol. And I love this sculpture because it's an action shot. You know, General Rose, the front lines general, you know, he was always involved. He was always leading his men. So I think it's a very appropriate statue. It's just not a stationary shot of him. It shows him doing what he loved, and that was serving his troops in the 3rd Armored Division. And this is the 3rd Armored Division arm patch. General Rose took over the 3rd Armored Division in, I think it was August 7th, 1944. The general that had been in charge of the division was a friend of Omar Bradley's, a fellow West Point graduate. His name was General Leroy Watkins, but he wasn't an armored command general. General Rose had experiences working with the Armored Division. And so they were unhappy with him. And this tells you everything you need to know about General Rose, because Omar Bradley had to make the difficult decision of replacing his friend, the commander of the 3rd Armored Division, a fellow West Point graduate, with General Rose, who was a high school dropout. So he demoted General Watkins, Leroy Watkins. And to Leroy Watkins' credit, he still wanted to be involved in the battle, so they put him in charge of the infantry division. And eventually he was promoted back to Major General. And just an interesting story, he went to California to retire from the Army, and he was the mayor of Beverly Hills in 1961 and 1962. But General Rose took over the 3rd Armored Division from General Leroy Watkins, and it was the choice of Omar Bradley. And again, this was on June 7th, 1944. And he reshaped 3rd Armored Division in his image. And the 3rd Armored Division, he called it Spearhead. They had a little tip of the spear. They had like an arrow tip on their shoulder patch. But he really changed the 3rd Armored Division. He wanted to give them a lot of pride. And it was difficult because they had to work with these horrible tanks, with the Sherman tanks. But he changed everything. He got them focused. And they led in almost every major battle in World War II. And from D- or D+1, he landed in Normandy. And he led the 2nd Armored Division at that time until they promoted him to 3rd Armored Division. But he was involved in every major battle through France, through Belgium, and then through Germany. In fact, he was the first American general to enter Germany and to take a German city. There's a lot of firsts that he was involved with, but this is the arm patch that they had. And this is Adam Makos and Clarence Smoyer. They came to the Pikes Peak Library District. This was in special collections, and this was in January of 2019. Back when we could all get together. Don't we miss those days? But they gave this print. When I did the documentary on Jim Bates in 1994 called Scenes of War, which you can see on YouTube, was about his combat career. His Clarence Smoyer purchased a copy of that documentary because it featured him in this tank battle. And at that point, after 1994, he reunited with Jim. He talked to Jim, and they became good friends. They talked a lot. And Clarence appreciated what Jim had done to follow the 3rd Armored Division and to capture this tank battle. So when Adam Makos wrote this book, Clarence wanted to donate something in Jim's honor. So they donated this print. If you go to special collections at the Pikes Peak Library District, you'll see this beautiful print of their T-26 tanks, and you can see the Cologne Cathedral in the background. So I got to meet Adam and I got to meet Clarence. And Clarence, as far as I know, is still alive. He's probably 97, 98 years old, but just a wonderful man. I wish he didn't have his hat on. I don't think there's any of that blonde curly hair left, and that's why he's wearing the hat. And this is a photo from the collection at the Pikes Peak Library District. This is Jim Bates, combat photographer. I think he was 27 when he went over to film the war, but he and I were good friends. Jim, one thing about Jim, he saved everything. He saved his still photos. He saved his motion picture films when he worked for the Alexander Film Company. And he saved his combat films. He made copies of his combat films. And he donated everything to the Pikes Peak Library District. And Jim passed away, I think it was 2002. But just a wonderful man. So lucky to meet him and all the connections and the wonderful resource the library has in their digital archives. I recommend you going online. And these photos, I'll show you one a little later of Winston Churchill that Jim had shot. And there's another connection to the story of the Battle of Cologne, Jim Bates and General Rose from Denver, Jim Bates, of course, from Colorado, grew up in Colorado Springs. But this young woman on the right is Adele Obadov, and her name at the time was Adele Brunel, and this is her brother Carl. And they actually grew up in Cologne, Germany. They were Jewish. And Adele and her brother witnessed Kristallnacht, the horrors of Kristallnacht. And there's a documentary that was done by the Greenberg Center for Learning and Tolerance. It was produced by Jane and Bob Neff. And they recorded the interview in our library. I think it was 2008 when it was finished. I'm not going to show you any clips of it, but it was it's on YouTube. It's called A Time to Remember, and I highly recommend it. It's just a very dramatic discussion of what happened during Kristallnacht. And after that, well, even before that, they knew they had to get out of Cologne, Germany. And it's just kind of fitting that the man who brought justice for what happened to Adele Obadov and her brother and her teacher, Eric Labansky, the man who brought justice to the city of Cologne was the Jewish American General Rose. And he liberated the city and defeated the Nazis. But when Adele went through Kristallnacht, it was just horrible. Her father owned a business. It was a barbershop supply business. And back then you'd have your business downstairs, and you'd have your apartment upstairs. And of course, she was going to school that day. And she noticed that at her synagogue in her school, all the religious objects were on the floor, and there were little fires everywhere, and the windows were broken. So she ran home. She was terrified. And when she got home, her mother was there. Her father had been out of town. The mob came down the street, and they were destroying the Jewish businesses. So they destroyed her parents' business while she was upstairs in the apartment. She could hear everything that was going on. And then they came up the stairs to their apartment. The mob came up to the stairs. She says she didn't know why, but they had a frosted glass by their door, and they could see the mob milling outside of her apartment. And of course, they thought they were dead. But for whatever reason, the mob did not go into the apartment. They just destroyed her parents' business. So she had to leave. The whole family had to leave. They had to figure out a way of doing it. And so her teacher at the Jewish school, Eric Klobonsky, he arranged to have 120 of his students sent to England to live with Jewish families in England. And this is for the brief moment that England had signed a peace treaty with Germany. And so Germany was allowing some Jewish families to move to England. So it was a brief moment in time that Adele luckily was able to slip through and get to England. And eventually she came to the United States, and she met her husband in Denver at a Jewish dance. And then they moved to Colorado Springs, where they opened up the clock shop. And I think it was on Circle. I think I'd been in that business at one time. But she raised her family in Colorado Springs. So again, another Colorado connection. But unfortunately, her teacher, who had saved her life and the life of another 120 students at her school, he was unable to escape. And Dr. Klobonsky, his wife, and his 3 sons died in the Holocaust. And there is a memorial square. The people of Cologne decided to remember him for what he did, saving those 120 students. And there is a square in Cologne that's dedicated to his memory. But again, all these stories tie in together with the Battle of Cologne. And this is the city of Denver about the time that General Rose moved to Colorado. And again, he was born in Middleton, Connecticut, 1899, but his father had contracted tuberculosis. And as probably a lot of you know, if you had tuberculosis back then, you had to find a climate where there was a lot of sunshine and dry. And Colorado was perfect. Of course, there was a lot of sanatoriums in Colorado Springs. So his family moved to Denver. And at the time, Denver had the largest Jewish population in the West. They had 15,000 Jews living in Denver. So it's a very welcoming place to come if you were Jewish and you wanted to move to the West. And it worked out well with their family. His father eventually was cured of tuberculosis. And he wanted to be a soldier when he was in Poland. He never became a soldier, but he became a police officer in Denver for the Park Service. So he was able to get a job as a police officer. This is General Rose's father, Sam Rose. And then eventually when he retired, he became a rabbi. He was a very religious, Orthodox man. And he became a rabbi for a synagogue in Denver. So General Rose grew up in a very conservative Jewish household. Again, his first language was Yiddish. But when he went to high school, for whatever reason, he struggled. I think he always wanted to be a soldier. He was interested in Civil War history. His hero was Abraham Lincoln. And he wanted to be a soldier. That was his focus. And at 16 years old, when Pancho Villa crossed the southern border of the United States and invaded the United States, he became inspired to join the Colorado National Guard Cavalry. He was 16. Of course, you had to be 18 to join unless your parents signed a permission slip. Well, they didn't sign a permission slip. He lied about his age. In fact, he lied about his age several times, as you'll see. He said he was 18, and he looked older than he was. He was very athletic, tall. He just looked like he was 18 or 19 years old. And so he went through basic training for the Colorado National Guard. Well, his mother found out that he had joined. I'll show you the Colorado National Guard at that time. His mother found out that he had joined, and she went to talk to his commanding officer, and she said, look, my son lied about his age. I didn't give permission for him to join. And so they worked out a deal. They said, well, let him finish up with basic, and if you decided later that you might be willing to let him join, sign the permission slip, he can do it. We're not going to send him down to Mexico with General Pershing, who was chasing after Pancho Villa. So after he went through basic, his father came and said, no, we want our son back home. We don't want him joining the Army. So, General Rose, or Maurice Rose at the time, was very despondent, but he went back home with his father, and they gave him an honorable discharge after his 8 weeks in the Colorado National Guard. And then he went back to Denver, and he worked in a meatpacking plant with his brother. But then the next year in 1917, Woodrow Wilson, after the sinking of the Lusitania, Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany. He went back to his parents. He was almost 18 years old. And he says, look, you got to sign my permission slip. And they were willing to do it. But he also lied about his age. This is his draft registration card. This is when he was already an officer, candidate school in Kansas. It says he's training at the school in Fort Riley, Kansas. You notice on his birthday, he puts November 26, 1895, and he lists his age as 22. Well, he was born in 1899. He was still 17 years old. So he got in this habit of lying about his age because he wanted to get into the fight. He really was motivated to become a soldier. And he also wanted to be an officer. He was very intelligent, very bright. He tested well for officer candidate school. And he needed officers. The Army was just expanding at such a rapid rate. So they looked the other way. They believed his lie. And he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and immediately sent overseas to France to fight in World War I. Well, in World War I, he was an excellent officer. And again, he was at the front lines, he was in the trenches, and he was injured in battle. I think he had a head injury and had a concussion. So they put him in a field hospital where he was recuperating. And they wouldn't release him. And he was so anxious to get bought out of the hospital that he snuck out. He went back to his troops within a couple weeks. And they didn't know why he was missing from the hospital. And of course, it was the fog of war. They had assumed that he had died of his wounds and had been sent to the morgue. So they listed him as killed in action. And they actually sent a telegram to his parents informing them that their son had been killed in action. And you can imagine how horrible that was for them to find out that, and they were in mourning for several weeks. And then they found out that he was still alive, that he was back with his troops. So the Army sent a second telegram saying that your son is still alive. He snuck out of the hospital and he's back with the troops on the front line. And so you can imagine their relief after, mourning their son for 2 weeks, thinking that he was dead and then finding out he was alive. Well, after he mustered out of World War I, he was there till the end of the war. I'll back up a little bit. He got out of the Army. He actually was in the reserves, and he became a meat salesman. He sold meat as a traveling salesman, and his territory was Utah. So he boarded with a Mormon family in Salt Lake. They let him stay there, and he met their daughter, and he fell in love with their daughter, and they eventually had a son. And then after a while, he got bored with civilian life. So he re-enlisted as active duty in the Army. And the Army life was hard on his wife, and they ended up getting a divorce. So the next 20 years, he traveled all over the United States as a cavalry officer. And he spent some time in Panama, I think it was 1930. And that's where he met his second wife. His second wife was the daughter of an Army veterinarian that was under his command. And her name was Virginia Behringer. And they married when he was in Panama. He did not tell his wife that he was Jewish. In fact, he didn't share his religion until their wedding night, which is interesting. But they had a wonderful marriage. The second marriage was wonderful. They had a son named Roderick, who went by Reese. And they were very much in love. And he was very devoted to his wife. In fact, when he was in Europe, he didn't cheat on her. Many of the generals, many of the officers had mistresses. Even Eisenhower had a mistress over in Europe, but not General Rose. He was dedicated to his wife. But anyway, in 1937, and of course, this is General Rose, high school graduate from Denver East High School. He went to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. And this was the most prestigious college in the Army. This is where they learned advanced combat techniques, and certainly armored warfare was a big deal back then. How to work with tanks, how to be successful. And that's where he met General Quesada. General Quesada was there. He was a pilot and eventually became the commander of the 9th Tactical Air Force. And that's kind of where they worked out the strategy of how armored forces and Air Force, the Air Corps, could work together. And they developed a successful strategy that worked throughout the war after they landed in Tunisia, North Africa. But this is General Rose. Again, you cannot find a picture of him where he's smiling. just very serious and focused. They did say he had a sense of humor, a dry sense of humor. But once he went to North Africa, he spent 20 hours a day planning his battles, coordinating his battles from the front. He was absolutely focused on the task. And when he arrived in North Africa, he was a lieutenant colonel. By the time he was in Sicily, he was promoted to brigadier general. So his efforts were definitely rewarded. But you can just see that intense look on his face, that very solemn stare. You wouldn't want to disappoint this man. If you were under him, the last thing you'd want to do is tell him something he didn't want to hear. But his men still loved him, even though they feared him. They certainly respected him. They loved him because they knew that he wouldn't ask them to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. And they constantly would see him at the front line. It was astounding to them that he would be willing to risk his life. And again, this is my favorite picture of General Rose. It tells you everything you need to know about him, that stern frown, that stern focused expression, his erect posture, sitting straight up. He has a Camel cigarette in his hand. He's a chain smoker. His in basket is empty. He never put off anything, very focused on the task. He was addicted to coffee as well. He drank several pots of coffee a day. He did not drink. He did not swear. Being an Orthodox Jew, growing up in a very conservative family, he did not use any profane language, unlike Patton. And he didn't fool around. He was completely devoted to his wife. And all he wanted to do was finish his task of defeating Nazi Germany and coming home to his family. And he talked about that even a few days before he was killed. They had kind of a press conference. A group of people came to his headquarters. And he talked about how he would love to just go back to being a lieutenant colonel in charge of a cavalry division, because he loved horses, he loved polo, and that was his most favorite time in the Army. He certainly was skilled at being an armored commander, but his first love was the cavalry, just like Patton. Patton was the first love was the cavalry as well. And this is General Rose. This is how you would see him in his Jeep. His entourage, when he was leading his men into battle, were two Jeeps. He would drive with two Jeeps. He'd be in the second Jeep, a couple of motorcycles, and I think an M20 command car that had about a half dozen soldiers in it. And that was his entourage. That was his entourage when he was killed in action, except they had all split up except for the two Jeeps. And they were alone when he was shot. I want to talk a little bit more about Pete Quesada, because he's a fascinating guy as well. Pete Quesada had been an athlete. He was a good football player, baseball player. And he went to the University of Maryland. And he dropped out because the Army recruited him. The Army had their own, Army Air Corps had their own football team. And one of the recruits had seen him as a quarterback for Maryland. And so they said, this guy would be a great quarterback. So he was in the Army Air Corps because they didn't have the Air Force then. He was on their football team. They played teams like the University of Texas. And he broke his leg. And when he healed from the injury, he couldn't play football anymore. So they said, well, you want to go through flight training? He said, sure. And that's when he fell in love with flying. He was born to be a pilot. So after he went through flight training, he never looked back on his athletic career. He was a pilot through and through. And like I said, he flew 90 combat missions in World War II. But where he became famous is he was part of the question mark flight. This is 2 years after the famous transatlantic flight by Lindbergh, 1927. And this crew almost got as famous as Lindbergh at the time, but they wanted to break the endurance record. So they had this old military plane and they hooked it up so they could do in-flight refueling. And it flew around the city of Los Angeles. And they flew for 150 hours. They broke the record and they kept refueling it. And I think there were 4 men in the crew, 4 pilots in the crew. They became famous after the flight. And this kind of got started Pete Quesada on his career. And he was very successful because he spoke Spanish. It was an asset for the Army Air Corps because they sent him to every country south of the border. He was in Cuba for a while. He was 2.5 years in South America and Argentina as an advisor for their Air Force. And he really had a wonderful career, mostly south of the border because of his ability to speak Spanish. And again, both General Rose and General Quesada, very handsome men, very athletic, good-looking men. Considering they were generals, they were relatively young. General Quesada was 38 when he became a brigadier general. General Rose, 43. But they really, you didn't look like your normal old man generals. They're good-looking men, and certainly General Quesada had that contagious smile on his face all the time, and General Rose had his stern frown. But they were, they connected because of their immigrant roots and the fact they weren't West Point graduates. Now, General Quesada got out of the Army Air Corps after the war. After World War II, the Army Air Corps became the Air Force. And right after it became the Air Force, he was still with the Air Force. They put him in charge of the tactical air forces. But he didn't get along with the head of the Air Force, Curtis LeMay, at the time. Curtis LeMay, who had a brilliant career, believed in strategic Air Force. And he thought because of the development of the atom bomb, that tactical air support wouldn't matter anymore. All they would do is say, get in a war and they drop atom bombs on everyone. But that wasn't the case. The only atom bomb that was ever dropped was on Japan, the two bombs that were dropped on Japan. And so they cut his budget. And General Quesada was really upset that he said, I'm going to retire. I don't want to put up with this crap anymore. So they cut his budget. He left the Air Force. He got married for the first time to this woman who was the granddaughter of Joseph Pulitzer. She had two daughters. Her husband had died in the war. In fact, he was killed over Japan. And he eventually had two sons with her. And he had a very successful civilian career. He married well. He married into money, and he did very well as a businessman. But they asked him to come back. As once Korea started, they realized that they were going to use the tactical air support in Korea. In fact, the tactical air support has been used in every war since starting with World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars. I mean, it's an important part. We don't drop nuclear bombs on people. We haven't yet since World War II. But they wanted him back. General Eisenhower tried to get him back, but he said, "No, I've started my civilian career. I have this young family. I don't want to go back into the service." But this was the key to his success. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, which had two 500-pound bombs on it, and it would lead the tanks into battle, and it destroyed probably more Tiger tanks and the Panther tanks than any Sherman tank did, any American Sherman tank did. And Pete Quesada was good friends with General Eisenhower. In fact, when General Eisenhower wanted to see what was going on in the battlefield, he used Pete as his pilot. And oftentimes they would cross over an enemy airspace with the Supreme Commander, which everybody was terrified something would happen. But General Eisenhower always chose Pete Quesada to be the one to be his pilot. And of course, there never was an incident. They were able to do this without anybody losing their life. And so General Eisenhower, when he became president, he decided to appoint Pete Quesada as the first administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. Their friendship, rolled over into the time that Eisenhower was president. In fact, Pete Quesada would talk to Omar Bradley all the time. They were good friends. He was good friends with Omar Bradley. I did talk to his son, Pete, about a month ago. We talked for about an hour. His son, I think, is in his 60s now. And General Quesada died, I think, about 1992. But his son said that he would talk to Omar Bradley almost once a month until Omar Bradley's death. But again, just that gregarious smile. This is when he was still in the Air Force. Now, I apologize to General Tecumseh Sherman and his tank. I've kind of been bad-mouthing it, but I'm not the only one that has bad-mouthed the American tank. I mean, when it was built, it was probably the best technology for its time. But as soon as the Germans improved their tanks, it just couldn't stand up. But you can see the small gun of the American Sherman tank. The Brits called it the Tommy cooker because the Brits used this tank as well. And they said when a shell hit it, it blew up and everybody burned up inside. And that's why they call it the Tommy cooker, unfortunately. But you can see the difference between the Sherman tank and the German Tiger tank. You know, it's almost the difference between a Chihuahua and a pit bull. The German Tiger tank had a huge gun. It had extra armor on it. It wasn't as maneuverable. It was a lot heavier than the Sherman tank, but it was pretty much undefeated in a tank battle. When it came a head-to-head tank battle with the Sherman tank, it was like taking a knife to a gun battle. It just didn't fare very well. And the other lighter German tank was the Panther tank. The same thing. It had extra armor. It had a huge gun on it. Very, very successful in tank-to-tank battles. Now, the one thing that the 3rd Armored Division had in its advantage was certainly the 9th Tactical Air Force, Pete Quesada, because they had overwhelming air power superiority over the Germans. The Germans were fighting a two-front war with Russia. So a lot of their planes and men and tanks were sent to Russia. So 3rd Armored Division had a little advantage over that, even though the tanks were inferior, because they could overwhelm them with air support. And that's why they were successful. But the problem came with the Battle of the Bulge. In the Battle of the Bulge, they lost 800 of the Sherman tanks. And the tanks crews were very disgruntled. They lost a lot of men. Many of the tanks crews had been shot out of 3 or 4 tanks. They were on their 5th tank, and they had no affection for the Sherman tank. And so Ann Stringer, who was a war correspondent for United Press, one of the few female correspondents in the war, she had lost her husband during the Battle of the Bulge. He was a correspondent as well, and he was hit with shrapnel and was killed. So she had a little bit of a chip on her shoulder. And she decided to talk to the tank crews because she had heard them grumbling about the Sherman tank. And she talked to them anonymously. And they told her how they hated the tank, how horrible it was in combat. And she wrote a story that was released in the United States. And it caused a stir. It caused a stir among the Army. It caused a stir among the family members of the tank crew, the wives and the parents of the tank crew, who were horrified that their sons and husbands were using tanks that were inferior. And so the Army had to do something about it. And they were building a new tank at the time. It was the T-26. It was also called the Pershing tank, named after General Pershing, who, going back to Pancho Villa, was the guy who chased after Pancho Villa when he invaded the United States. But the T-26 was a far superior tank to anything that the Americans had. And so they sped up its manufacturing. It was manufactured in Detroit, and they rolled off a few of these tanks in Detroit, but they only had 20 of them. And they sent 20 of them, I think, in February of 1945 to the 3rd Armored Division. They had 10 of these tanks, and they selected the best crews to run the T-26 tanks. And one of those crews was this crew, the crew of that Clarence Smoyer was the gunner on. And this photo was actually shot by Jim Bates after the successful Battle of Cologne, where they shot the Sherman tank in front of the Cologne Cathedral. And these guys they're from every part of the world. Of course, back then the black troops were separated from the white troops, but this group of men, had very colorful backgrounds from different parts of the United States, and all of them had nicknames. So I just want to read to you their names. I just think it's interesting. And we'll start with the bottom row. The guy with a cigarette on the left, he looks like he's 35, but he's actually only 20 years old. He's from Moorhead, Kentucky, a coal mining town, had a hard scrabble life, tough guy. And his name was Gunner Corporal Homer Davis. And of course, his nickname was Smokey. He always had a cigarette in his mouth. Now, next to him on the bottom row is their driver, Corporal William McVeigh. His nickname was Woody. He was a 19-year-old Irish American from Michigan, just a kid. Many of these crew members were kids, of course. Clarence Moyer was 21. Now let's go on the top row from left to right. And then we have the old man of the crew. He's the tank commander, Sergeant Robert Early. He was often seen smoking a pipe. He was 29 years old from Fountain, Minnesota. And next to him is the gunner, Clarence Moyer, refused to wear his helmet, didn't want to cover his beautiful hair, 21 years old from Pennsylvania. He was Pennsylvania Dutch, so he did speak German, which came in handy certainly when they were fighting through Germany. They could use him as to interrogate the troops and as a translator. But his family, they were very religious and they were pacifists. They didn't like the idea of him becoming a soldier, but he felt it was very important. He loved to roller skate. That was his favorite thing. That's where he met his girlfriend before he was sent into the Army. And she would often send him packets of fudge and brownies and cookies during the war. And they eventually got married when he came back to Pennsylvania. And next to him, the guy who looks like Robert Mitchum, handsome young guy, was Corporal John DeRiggi, 20-year-old Italian-American from Scranton, Pennsylvania. His nickname was Johnny Boy, because usually when it was time for dinner, his parents had to look for him. He was in the neighborhood running around with his friends, and they often had to shout out, Johnny Boy, it's time to come home. So anyway, this is right out of for those of you that are old enough to remember the television show Combat, it's right out of Combat, and all such great characters. And in the book by Adam Makos, Spearhead, he goes into detail on their lives. So it's just worth reading the book just to find out more about this tank crew. And this is a young Clarence Moyer, reluctantly wearing his cap. He was 21 years old, just a scrub-faced kid. Again, he loved to roller skate. When he came back after the war, took his girlfriend roller skating and proposed to her, and they were married for 50 years. He had a daughter that came out with him when they did the book tour. His wife, I think, passed away about 5 to 6 years ago. But just a wonderful, gentle person, a pacifist, really. He was not who you would think would be just a sharpshooter with a tank gun, but he saved their crew many a times by his ability to work that gun. And of course, this is General Rose, where he was for most of his career, leading his troops in his Jeep, and unfortunately where he died as well on March 30th, 1945. I'm going to go back a little bit. So I want to talk about the circumstance of his death. And I did a documentary on General Rose this summer, which is on YouTube. You can see the entire documentary. I'm going to show you some segments of it at some point. And I think we're almost an hour into this, so I'm going to try and speed this up a little bit. But it happened that 3 days before he was killed in action, and this is the story, and there's different versions of this story, but the version that I have here is it said, on the way back to the command post on March 27th, 1945, General Rose and his driver Shantz was driving along a narrow back road near the village of Rehe when General Rose spotted a group of 15 to 18 Germans, probably stragglers cut off by the rapid American advance, crossing the road ahead of the Jeep. They ducked into a roadside cemetery and took cover behind the surrounding wall and headstone. Major Bellinger described to AP correspondent Jack Thompson what happened next. Before Shantz could bring the Jeep to a complete stop, General Rose leaped out, yelling to the others to follow him. He pulled out his .45 automatic and started firing. One German ran out from his position and aimed his Mauser rifle directly at Rose. The general shot him where he stood. Now, there's other stories that say somebody else shot him and injured him. Several of the enemy fled, and the remaining dozen Germans surrendered. The men in the M20, which had now driven up, joined the others just as the firefight ended. They watched in amazement as General Rose personally herded the prisoners out of the cemetery at the point of the pistol. Now, here's a general. He did not have to do this. He did not have to jump out of his Jeep, pull out his .45, and chase after German soldiers. He could have safely stayed where he was and sent his men in. But he felt it so important that they capture these Germans who were behind Allied lines, because he felt in his heart that they could be killing Americans, and he would feel so much guilt and remorse if these same Germans killed some of his troops. So, like General Rose, he just said, I need to take care of this now. And this is 3 days before he was killed in action. So it's no surprise how he would always get himself into trouble because of his heroics, his heroic nature. But anyway, on the day of his death, March 30th, 1945, he had broke a record. They were closing what they called the Ruhr pocket. And of course, this is near the end of the war. And a lot of the Germans were surrendering at that time. In fact, they moved 90 miles across the Ruhr pocket, taking prisoners. And, there were still some very loyal Nazis fighting, and they would get into these skirmishes. But in one day, he traveled 90 miles with his command group. And when they got near Paderborn, Germany, they found themselves behind enemy lines. And so they kind of split up, and General Rose in his Jeep went with another Jeep in front of him. And it was dusk. This is almost the end of the day. They had traveled 90 miles, which the 3rd Armored Division had traveled 90 miles, which was a record for a modern armored division. And so he was, they saw in the distance a tank, and they thought it was one of theirs, the T-26. And as they got closer, they realized that it was actually a Tiger tank. So the lead Jeep drove right by the Tiger tank and was able to get through. But General Rose, by the time his Jeep got to the Tiger tank, who saw that it was an American Jeep, turned into the tank and pinned it against a tree. And unfortunately, they had to jump out of their Jeep, and the Tiger commander opened the lid on the hatch on the tank and had a machine pistol and pointed at them and was shouting at them in German to surrender their weapons. So the two, the aide and Bellinger and the driver had shoulder holsters. And so they removed their shoulder holsters and dropped their weapons. General Rose's weapon, his 45, was a belt on his waist. So they put his hands to unbuckle his belt. At least they assumed that's what happened. There's still a chance he may have been going for his gun. But the driver, who was anxious as it was, saw what he was doing, shot him in the head and killed him instantly. He did not, the driver of the tank or the commander of the tank did not know that he had shot an American general, because General Rose had all these papers on him, and they just left him there. They left the Jeep there. They left General Rose with his papers. Had they known he was a general, they probably would have just grabbed him and taken him prisoner. But unfortunately, he was killed. Next day, a couple American soldiers came and took him back, and they buried him on April 2nd. But this is the helmet. I mean, you say a picture tells a story. This is General Rose's helmet, tragically killed on March 30th, 1945. But this helmet has found a home recently, and it's a very appropriate place. This is a new Army museum in Washington, D.C. It just opened up, and they have a display, and they have General Rose's helmet there. I would love to go to Washington again someday and check out the museum. So fortunately, he's getting a little more notoriety for what he has done, what he accomplished in his career. But unfortunately, they just, as he died, he never had a chance to write a memoir, and his story hasn't been told. It really hasn't been told. I mean, there's thousands of documentaries and films on World War II. And other than my little no-budget documentary that I produce, there's not a single documentary on the life and heroics of General Rose. So this is General Rose's grave in the Netherlands. He was initially buried in Germany, Ittenbach, Germany, on April 2nd. And his boss, General Collins, didn't know that his best general was Jewish. So they put a Christian cross on his grave. When his family found out, they wrote the chaplain, and there was a rabbi chaplain with the 3rd Armored Division. His name was Elephant. His last name was Elephant. So he took the cross down at General Rose's grave in Germany, and he put a Star of David up. And that remained until they exhumed his body and then reburied him in this graveyard in the Netherlands. Now, they're not clear if the Star of David was initially put there. There's still some controversy on that. There's a chance his wife, who was Episcopalian, wanted a Christian cross on her husband's grave. They're not sure, but there is a Christian cross right now. And there's still controversy about this. And there's still an effort. Here it is, 76 years after his death, to put the Star of David on his grave, which I think they should. And so he has grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They're not Christian, but they respect the fact that their grandfather and what he did. And I think they're working to help with the effort to eventually put a Star of David on his grave. Now, he should be in Arlington. And they talked about that in the past, but I don't know what the requirements are at this point for him to be exhumed and sent to Arlington, but he certainly deserves being placed in Arlington here in this country. And so he didn't talk about his religion. So there's, people have argued back and forth, even though he was culturally Jewish, that he didn't practice his religion. But there was an organization that supported Jewish troops in World War I and World War II called the National Jewish Welfare Board. It was almost like the USO. In fact, they were combined with the USO. And this is the card. So he was registered with this organization. Now, it could have been his father and his mother signed him up for it, but he definitely was registered for the Jewish Support Organization, which is another reason why there should be a Star of David on his grave. Now, General Eisenhower wrote this beautiful letter to his widow after General Rose died, and General Eisenhower respected General Rose and admired him for everything he accomplished. And I'm going to read the letter that he wrote to his widow, Virginia Barringer. He said, "My dear Mrs. Rose, although I have not been privileged to meet you personally, my admiration, respect, and affection for your late husband were so profound that I feel impelled to send you some words of sympathy in your tragic loss. He was not only one of our bravest and best, but was a leader who inspired his men to speedy accomplishment of tasks to a lesser man would have appeared almost impossible. He was out in front of his division, leading it in one of its many famous actions when he met his death. I hope that your realization of the extraordinary worth of the services to his country will help you in some small way to bear the burden of your grief. The thoughts and prayers of the legion of his warm friends in the theater are with you. Most sincerely, Dwight D. Eisenhower." It's a wonderful letter. Now, after General Rose died, there was an effort in the Jewish community in Denver to build a hospital in his name, and it still exists. It has a different name. I think the hospital has been sold, but it's still the Rose Hospital. And it was a General Rose Memorial Hospital. This is his mother, Katie, at the groundbreaking ceremony. His father died a couple months after he was killed in action. I think his father was in such grief. But his men of the 3rd Armored Division, they raised $3,000. This is the dog-faced soldiers who gave 10, 20 bucks towards this hospital. It's $1 million hospital. When it was built in 1947, it was the only hospital in Denver that allowed African-American surgeons, physicians to practice there. No other hospital in Denver would allow Black physicians to practice, but at the Rose Hospital. So it's really groundbreaking in many ways. Now, I came across this article just the other day, and I want to read from it. And it's one of the most astonishing tributes to General Rose that I have seen. It's a 1991 article, thoroughly researched. It's about 10 pages, and it's online. You can find it online. It's in the 1991 issue of Armor Magazine. I'm sure we all have read Armor Magazine. I'm just kidding. But Armor Magazine it's more of a military publication. But this physician in World War II, his name is Dr. Ralph Green. He wrote this article. He researched it, thoroughly researched. Again, we wrote it in 1991, so he had an opportunity to talk to the men that served under General Rose and get quotes. And it's really wonderful because his men are just effusive about how much they love him. But they did talk to his commander, and they got this quote from General Collins. Now, his commander was General Joseph Lawton Collins. He was known as Lightning Joe Collins. And they were Lightning Joe because they tore across Germany to end the war. And General Rose was his lead general commander. But General Collins is interesting. He's the uncle of Michael Collins, who was on Apollo 11. He was the one who stayed in the command module. He didn't walk on the moon, but Michael Collins is his nephew. But he said this about General Rose, and I'll read it to you. General Collins said, Maurice Rose was the top armored commander. More than any man in the world, he deserves credit for bringing this war to a conclusion at least 5 or 6 months sooner than it would have been otherwise. He's saying that General Rose, one man, was responsible for ending the war in Germany 5 to 6 months sooner, and that was General Rose. And nobody knows about this man. Not a lot of people know about him. I shouldn't say nobody knows about him. You know about him now. But, one man who is responsible for bringing the war in Europe to a close 5 to 6 months early. And then he says, Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Generals Marshall, Bradley, and Hodges echo these eulogies. So that's a remarkable statement. That's as remarkable statement as you can get. And I really believe he deserves the Medal of Honor. And I hope there's an effort to see that General Rose gets the Medal of Honor. I'll talk a little bit more about Jim Bates, but Jim Bates, who was a combat photographer, after the war, he came back and went to work for the Alexander Film Company. And he actually designed this helicopter mount. It was like a Steadicam shot that was used in many feature films in a famous 1964 commercial, Chevrolet commercial that was shot in Moab, Utah, of a 1964 Chevrolet on top of this pinnacle rock and these beautiful aerial footage. In another program I do in the Alexander Film Company, I show that spot, but not today. But again, I met Jim, I think about 1992, and we became very good friends. And his collection is in the Pikes Peak Library District and in special collections, and you can see it on the digital archives online. But and I just want to mention one thing. My father and 2 of my uncles were in World War II. So this has a personal story for me, especially since reading that General Rose may have ended the war 5 months earlier. Who knows if it had lasted another 5 months, if my Uncle Victor would have been killed or my father would have been killed. So I thank General Rose for his heroics. But this is my uncle, Captain Victor Calvo. He was born in 1924, died in 2010. He was valedictorian of his high school. My grandfather was a farmer. Believe it or not, Mountain View, which is now the headquarters of Google, was farmland when my mother and her siblings were growing up, and my grandfather was a farmer. My grandfather, who came from Spain, just like General Quesada, and my grandmother, they were indentured servants. They went to Hawaii and then worked off their passage and immigrated to the Bay Area. My grandmother had a 6th grade education. My grandfather had a 4th grade education. My Uncle Victor graduated from Mountain View High School. He was valedictorian, very bright man, and he wanted to be a fighter pilot. And he tested very well, and he was going to be a fighter pilot, but they said, no, we need more B-24 crews and B-17 crews. The casualty rate for B-24 and B-17 crews was 50%, either shot down or killed in action. And so he was sent to Italy, like Catch-22. They flew out of Italy. This is towards the end of the war. I think he landed in Italy in November of 1944. But they flew over the Alps and bombed Germany, and they also bombed the Plesty oil fields in Poland, famous bombing raids. But he flew 35 missions as a co-pilot. My cousin told me they actually flew another 10 missions, secret missions, that they flew alone in one plane just to scout their bombing sites or bombing locations. But he was a remarkable man. He ended up coming back to Mountain View. He had a couple of businesses. He had a lumber company, and he went to Stanford University on the GI Bill and graduated from Stanford. And when you consider his parents had a 6th grade education and a 4th grade education, they believed in their children being educated, and they saw all of them go to college, including my mother, who went to San Jose State Teacher College, where she met my dad. But I just want to mention him because he ended up becoming the mayor of Mountain View, and he was in the California Assemblyman, and then also on the Public Utilities Commission. But he had a remarkable career. Now, he didn't like to talk about his military career. But he did tell me once that they got back from a mission and they counted 247 shrapnel holes in their plane. And they were escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen into battle, which is another interesting connection. But he also said that, he'd be sitting at lunch with a friend, eating lunch, and the next day his friend would be gone, either shot down, killed, or captured. And this is my favorite picture. This was shot by Jim Bates right at the end of the war. This was of Winston Churchill. He was touring the German Reichstag with the Russians at the time. And I love this photo because the war had just ended, and there's not a look of celebration on his face. Millions of Europeans have died, Germans, German civilians, German soldiers, American, British, French, British civilians. It's been a horrible war. It took its toll on a lot of people. A lot of lives were affected by this war. And there's not a look of celebration. It's almost a look of relief that this horrible war is finally over. And I love this photo. And of course, Churchill was a magnificent leader whose story has been told lots of times. So I think we need a little bit of a story on General Rose now. Now, this young man, and I'm thinking maybe my audience, no one in my audience, anybody under 30 would recognize this guy, but it's kind of hard for me to believe that. This is Elvis Aaron Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi. No matter how famous General Rose gets, or Clarence Smoyer, this man will always be the most famous person connected to the 3rd Armored Division. You can see the famous spearhead patch on his shoulder. Elvis Aaron Presley was in Germany in 1960 and 1961. He was a tank driver. You can see the tank that he's sitting in. And I think the 3rd Armored Division now is in mothballs, but they made quite an impact in the war. And again, many of these stories are in my book. I think we're going to take a little bit of a break, but you can get this book on Amazon. The story of the Alexander Film Company, the story of Jim Bates. Unfortunately, not the story of General Rose. I wrote a chapter later on, and I hope to include it in an audio book that I'm going to do. But let me get out of here, and we're going to take any questions, and then I'll show some clips. Let me stop. Are we there? Everybody hear and see everything?
I think we're good. I think we have one question in chat.
Sure.
Did the other guys in Jeep survive?
Yes, the driver, and that's a good question. The driver, Shantz was his name, and his aide, Major Bellinger, they were not shot. As soon as the General Rose was shot, they just took off in the darkness, and they had to sneak back across enemy lines. They were shot at, they were pursued, but nobody left the tank to go after them. So they hid in the field. They slept overnight in a field. They were separated. They didn't go back together, and then they went back to American lines and told them what happened. Then the next day, they sent a Jeep with 2 other soldiers to pick up General Rose, and everything was still there. His body was still there. His secret codes were in his coat, were still there. They didn't touch anything, and his Jeep was still there. Now, one thing that the driver did do, because the Jeep had the 2-star license plate on it, and when they were caught behind enemy lines, the driver was smart, and he says, "Let me take the plates off the Jeep, because if they see that you're a general, we're going to be in trouble." So they took the plates off, threw it into the Jeep, and the tank commander didn't know that he had shot an American general.
Any other questions? You can unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
When I saw the write-up on the presentation, I did a little bit of research. I watched that half-hour show on Adele Obadov. It was very, very good. Checked a little bit further. She's 94 and living in Seattle, Washington.
Yes, I write a chapter in my book about her, and we talked over the phone when I was writing the book. I haven't talked to her since, and that was 2 years ago. But yeah, that's good to hear, because I know she was living with her daughter in Seattle. That's where we communicated. Her brother has passed on. Her brother Carl, who actually the whole family, it's interesting because the whole family made it back to the United States, and they all did it separately. They sent their son to Chicago. They're able to send him to Chicago, and then they got passage to go to the United States on a ship. and they were going to go out of Spain. I think, or no, out of Portugal. They were going to go out of Portugal. And they missed the ship because they took the train, and the train was being used for military use. So they didn't make it to Portugal in time to get on the ship. So they had to be hidden in Barcelona, Spain, for a couple more years until they were able to leave to the United States. Now, Adele made it to England, and she stayed there during the early part of the war, and she worked in the war industry. I think she was a seamstress. And then she was able to get back to the United States. Her brother joined the Army, and because he became an American citizen, he was able to have everybody eventually come back to the U.S. He was able to get them become naturalized citizens. But she ended up taking a troop ship back to Canada that was empty because the ship had left off the troops from Canada. So she was almost alone on the ship, and then eventually reunited with her family. I don't know if they lived in Denver at that time or not, but yeah, remarkable woman. And if you saw the documentary, just an incredible memory, and just horrific what she experienced. But they did survive, and they were able to make it back to the United States.
Anyone else?
Well, I can show you some videos. So I go ahead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead, Steve.
In this first one, is from my documentary, and it shows you his burial, and I talk about his death as well. But let me go ahead and make sure. We'll go ahead and start it.
On March 6, 1945, the second day of the 3rd Armored Division's battle for Cologne started from the railroad underpass at the West Railroad Station on Venloorstrasse. Machine guns set up on rubble piles protected the column along the track area to the north.
There are moments in a person's life when their training, talent, and heart are tested to the extreme. Jim Bates' finest hour was during the Battle of Cologne. For a veteran combat photographer, it was an opportunity to test all his skills as a soldier and as a photographer. It was his success in Cologne that earned him the Bronze Star.
The German tank is found, and the T-26 hits its marks. The German tank is hit squarely, and as the gunner tries to escape, the second shell cuts off his leg. The driver and assistant clamber to escape as another shell is fired. Burning alive, the gunner lies over the edge of his coffin on wheels while his companions run for cover. And the concussion from the 90mm gun is so great, camera steadiness is impossible.
Cologne was the next, I imagine, the greatest part of my life. By this time, we had a new T-26, and the T-26 had a 90mm with a cuts compensator on the front of it. It was an amazing piece of machinery. It was heavily armored. It was just, it was a far cry. The Germans that saw it really never lived to bring back the story, because that was it. They never lived long enough to take the story back as to what this tank was about. It was just so far ahead of the old Shermans that it was unbelievable. So I thought, well, I was just a little bit impatient, and I got out, and I think the German tank, the Tiger tank, saw me, because he started to turn his turret around, and about that time I heard the tank coming up, our T-26 coming up. And the very second that he stopped, I was shooting by that time. And in the film, you can see the armor-piercing shell going through the bottom of the picture on the still shots. The first shot went in and cut the legs off of the tank commander in the Tiger. The second shot, and immediately the driver and the bow gunner, the trap doors flew open, and they climbed out. But a second shot had gotten the shrapnel had gotten them too. One fella fell over a bicycle that was laying there on the ground, the remains of an old bicycle, and he died right there. But the driver got around to the backside of a building, and he died there. The gunner, the tank commander that had his legs cut off, of course, just laid on top of his tank and burned up right in front of the camera there. It was just unbelievable. That thing was burning even the next morning. After it was all over, there was still smoke coming out of it because it had so much ammunition and whatnot in it. It was just everything that could happen to me, photographically speaking, did happen that day. There was everything from street fighting to house-to-house fighting, everything that could happen, and consequently, it really was the crux of me getting a Bronze Star. That whole period of time that I worked with the 3rd Armored Division.
A very tired and silent crew it was that dealt the death blow to the German tank, to help prove to a nation crazed with power that its men and cities could be dealt with in the same manner as it had previously dealt with Poland and Russia when the war was going its way. The tall spires of the Cologne Cathedral now mark only the grave of a dead and battle-torn city.
On March 18th, he requisitioned a stadium near Cologne and presented his troops medals for their brave actions during the Battle of Cologne. This is probably the last film footage shot of the general. It was also shot by Jim Bates, and you get a sense of the general's intensity, his athletic and handsome appearance, and his appreciation for his men. During the evening of March 28th, his public information officer invited several well-known journalists to meet with the general on an informal basis at his command headquarters. The journalists stayed for several hours and saw a side to the general that they had never witnessed before. The taciturn general, who could see the end of the war in Europe and was in a good mood that night, talked with the journalists with unusual openness. They asked him what his plans were after the war, and he gave a rare glimpse into his personal life and feelings. "I have a son," said General Rose. "He is 4 years old, and I don't know him. We're going to get acquainted, and that is going to take a long time." The film footage you are watching was shot on March 29th of the 3rd Armored Division on their final push through Germany and their last major battle. You can see large members of German troops surrendering, and in less than a week after this film was shot, 350,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Americans. On March 30th, the next day after these films were taken, the general was killed in action. It was dusk, and the frontline general was cut off from his troops, and his driver was trying to get back to the American lines and to the city of Paderborn. They saw a tank in the distance, and they thought it was one of the new American T-26 tanks at first. As they drove closer in the darkness, they saw that it was actually a Tiger tank, and they tried to speed past it on the narrow road. His Jeep got stuck between an embankment and the Tiger tank. The general, his driver, and his aide abandoned the Jeep and jumped into a ditch. The tank commander of the Tiger tank opened the hatch and started screaming at them in German to surrender their weapons. The 3 men slowly dropped their weapons and put their hands up. With his 3 prisoners disarmed, the tank commander shot his machine pistol into the general and killed him instantly with a headshot. The driver and General Rose's aide were able to escape and hid in the field before they could get back to the American lines. 2 American soldiers came back the next day and retrieved the general's body. Since the general's body had not been searched and their important maps and papers were still in the Jeep, they assumed the tank commander did not know he had shot an American general in cold blood. An autopsy revealed General Rose had wounds in his hands and fingers, which indicated his hands had been held up in surrender when he was shot. General Maurice Rose was buried on April 2nd in a grave surrounded by his men who had also been killed in action in the city of Ittenbach, Germany. Since his commanding officer did not know his finest general was Jewish, they put a Christian cross on his grave. When the 90-year-old rabbi, Sam Rose, was informed of his son's death, it had a profound effect on him, and he and his wife went into mourning. Remembering back to World War I, both Sam and his wife Katie were hoping for another telegram that would tell them that their son was actually alive. But that second telegram never came. Speaking to a Rocky Mountain news reporter, the rabbi talked about the importance of his son's sacrifice to his country and to the Jewish people during the time of Passover. It is well that since this had to happen, it happened in the week of Passover, said Rabbi Rose. As Jehovah said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." He spoke not only to the Jews, but to the Gentiles, to Americans, to Germans, to all people. When I see the sacrifice, the blood, I will pass over you. And so may Jehovah accept the sacrifice and see the blood and pass over all peoples for their sins at this Passover time, for my son's sake. Only 3 months later, on July 10th, consumed with grief, Rabbi Sam Rose reunited with his son in death.
Anyway, that's part of the documentary. You may have heard my dog in the background. I hope not. Did you hear my dog or not? Maybe she was making noise. I'm going to show you another clip. This is a documentary. It's a short documentary produced by the Aviation Hall of Fame, where Pete Quesada is in, and it's very well done. Now let me find it here. It's about 6 minutes, but it tells his story. Gotta hit shared screen.
During the D-Day invasion of 1944, vital low-level reconnaissance of the Normandy beaches fell under Major General Pete Quesada's command. These extremely hazardous missions had to be flown at altitudes of just 15 to 20 feet into heavy German defenses. Doubts and gripes abounded among the pilots, until, that is, Quesada personally met with his flyers. With a gift for igniting a pilot's killer instinct, it wasn't long before Quesada's men refused practice sessions and diversionary tactics. "We're ready to go now," the energized fighter pilots told their commander. "Just tell us what you want, and we'll make sure you get it." Elwood Ricardo Pete Quesada was born on April 13, 1904, in Washington, D.C., to Lope Lopez Quesada and Helen A. McNamara. High school was spent at Wyoming Seminary in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Quesada then attended the University of Maryland and Georgetown University before leaving college to enlist in the Air Service in 1924. In 1927, he earned his commission as a second lieutenant, his first assignment as engineering officer at Bowling Field, Washington, D.C. He was part of the 5-man crew, including Major Carl Spatz and Captain Ira Aker, to answer the question, how long can an aircraft stay airborne? On New Year's Day, 1929, flying a Fokker C-2A tri-motor dubbed the Question Mark, the crew lifted off from Van Nuys, California, to find out. Only 150 hours later, after 43 air-to-air exchanges and 11,000 miles of flight, did the transport and record-setting crew return to Van Nuys. Quesada and his crewmates were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. A wide variety of assignments followed, among them flying as an airmail pilot and serving 2.5 years as an advisor to Argentina's Air Force. A year at the Army Command and General Staff School prior to World War II convinced Quesada that, quote, "Future war will require all sorts of arrangements between the air and the ground, and the two will have to work closer than a lot of people think or want," end of quote. In July 1941, Major Quesada was assigned commanding officer of the 33rd Pursuit Group at Mitchell Field in New York. With the United States' involvement in World War II, Pete's duties and rank advanced rapidly. After a stint at Lieutenant General Arnold's headquarters in command of a fighter group, Quesada, promoted to Brigadier General, subsequently set up the 1st Air Defense Wing, deploying to North Africa soon after. By early 1943, he commanded the 12th Fighter Command and was Deputy Commanding General of the Northwest African Coastal Air Force in the Mediterranean. Quesada immersed himself in the new technologies such as radar and radio communications, and flew operational flights in the Tunisian, Sicilian, Corsican, and Italian campaigns. By the fall of 1943, Quesada was called to England by 8th Air Force Commander Major General Acre. There, Quesada was appointed the new commanding general of the 9th Fighter Command and the 9th Tactical Air Command. Both leaders knew the new flexible tactics of close air support would play an integral role in the upcoming invasion. In the run-up to D-Day, June 6, 1944, Quesada put his command through rigorous training in low-level armed reconnaissance, train and tank busting, and dive bombing. By D-Day +1, the 40-year-old general was directing the 1,500 aircraft under his command from his advance headquarters on an airstrip carved out just above Utah Beach. New tactics included placing pilots in front-line tanks as forward air controllers equipped with VHF radios and using microwave early warning radar to vector fighter bombers in real time to their targets. Quesada's leadership of the 9th Air Force was credited by many Army commanders as being a key to the Allies' victory on the Western Front. And by war's end, Quesada, by then known as the Pilot's General, had himself flown 90 combat missions. Post-war, Quesada was promoted to Lieutenant General in March of 1946, and in 1947 was appointed as the first commander of the Tactical Air Command in the newly independent U.S. Air Force. In October 1946, Quesada gave up his bachelor status, marrying Kate Davis Pulitzer Putnam, a war widow with 2 young daughters. The couple eventually had 2 sons, Thomas Ricardo and Peter Wickham. Subsequent assignments after leaving TAC included Special Assistant for Reserve Forces at the Air Force Headquarters, Chairman of the Joint Technical Planning Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Commanding General of Joint Task Force 3. After 27 years of service to his country, Lieutenant General Quesada retired from the Air Force on October 31st, 1951. He then held a variety of positions in private industry before President Eisenhower recruited Quesada to become his special assistant for aviation matters and soon chairman of the Airways Modernization Board. There he worked to organize the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. And when on November 1st, 1958, the FAA was launched, Quesada was its first administrator, serving until January 1961. In the years after his work for the FAA, Quesada was co-owner of the Washington Senators baseball team and chairman and CEO of L'Enfant Plaza Properties in Washington. He passed away on February 9, 1993, at age 88. In recognition of his contributions to military air power and to advancing the safety of aviation in service to his country, Lieutenant General Elwood Pete Quesada is enshrined in the National Aviation Hall of Fame.
So he had an amazing career as well, certainly as a civilian, what he did as a soldier and what he did as a civilian. It was almost a second life. So I'm going to show you some more footage. This is the raw footage of that Jim Bates shot from the National Archives of General Rose pinning medals. And it's a little more long form, but you get a sense of, I think you can see this. You get a sense of his physical appearance. I might have to move ahead on this. I'm not sure. Yeah, there you go. But he was a relatively young man. I'll skip ahead. That went too far. Let me get back. Okay, should be able to see it now. But he was a relatively young man. This is after the Battle of Cologne. I think it's March 18th. And again, Jim Bates is the combat photographer. Jim Bates, he spoke very highly of General Rose. He's told me his men loved him. Jim Bates did not like Patton at all. He had some problems with Patton. He thought Patton was horrible to his troops, but he felt the opposite about General Rose. Although General Patton was one of the people who promoted Rose in Tunisia, North Africa. He's one of the people that championed the ability of General Rose. And of course, they both shared similar backgrounds as cavalry officers. They both loved horses, playing polo. But you can see him walking, just this very definite pace, powerful, athletic look. They said that it's kind of like it came out of central casting, how you think a general would look if you pick somebody out of central casting. But it was more than his appearance. It was his ability too. I think they're taking him to another site where he's giving medals out. I'm surprised they have a band out there. Imagine even though it's they're on the front lines in combat, they still have the Army band available for ceremony. But again, never smiling. There's almost a slight grin on his face when he's giving medals to his men. This guy's grinning. This guy cannot stop smiling. And there's Jim's slate, March 18th. So I'm going to show you another segment of Jim Bates. Close this out. Now, in 1999, I was approached when I worked for the library by Steven Spielberg's company. They were doing a documentary called Shooting War, which was finished in 2000. And they featured about a dozen combat photographers from World War II, and they wanted to include Jim Bates. It was also narrated by Tom Hanks, and it was shown nationally on ABC in the year 2000. So they gave me this clip from the documentary, and they were able to find some interesting footage that Jim shot during the Battle of the Bulge while following the 3rd Armored Division. But let me go ahead and set that up, and you'll hear the familiar voice of Tom Hanks narrating. Let me share screen again. Where is that? Where am I? There I am. But this has narration too. Okay, there it is. It should work.
Americans manning this line were often isolated in small units. Communications between them were poor. They were not expecting the battle that began on December 16th. Many of the GIs fought tenaciously, though they were often completely surrounded by the enemy. The Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble of the war, eventually extended 50 miles eastward, but it did not burst. It's hard to see from these pictures, but this engagement eventually involved more soldiers, 600,000 of them, than any battle in U.S. history. 20,000 Americans died in the Ardennes. Another 20,000 were wounded, Among them was a cameraman named Jim Bates, who had been in the war since D-Day. At the Bulge, he did what a lot of GIs did. He hitched a ride on a tank. Their motors provided warmth.
I rattled this one tank and I asked him if I could ride on the back, and the lid flew open. He says, "Can you fire a machine gun?" I said I had my basics with 11th Armored Division, and my guys, they picked me up bodily practically and put me in the bow gunner's position.
Bates didn't know it, but he was heading into battle with German Tiger tanks. He grabbed these unique shots of a German ambulance aiding one of their wounded tank crews.
I could see that the number 1 tank had passed an open area and was firing uphill. And about that time, I could hear this ka-thunk, and the tank commander says, "Get the hell out of here, they're shooting at us broadside." About that time, that second boom came along, and it felt like a train hit me in the back. I didn't know whether I was dead or alive, and I could hear him screaming, "If you're not hit, get up as soon as you can, because if he gets that tank started again, he's going to run over you." And I looked back, and my camera was laying directly under the tank treads. Well, that's what made me move. And they were on the radio, and they said, "You get up here right quick with the medic's jeep." He said, "This photographer's been hit, and there's not enough of them left to hardly photograph the rest of the war." And I said, "Well, I'll ride on the hood. I don't care." I said, "I can lay down and at least be a warm place to be for a bit."
Ignoring his wounds, Bates kept on shooting as the tank rumbled toward the rear.
Rosie saw me, the fellow I normally work with. He was my buddy and shooting partner. And he said, "The hospital's right next door. Take you over there." I said, "Not yet. Get on your typewriter and I'm going to dictate to you what, where, why, and when." He says, "You won't quit, will you?" And I said, "No way."
Meantime, Nazi Germany was in its death throes, but it desperately fought on.
Everything that could happen to me, photographically speaking, did happen that day.
The place was Cologne. The date was March 6th, 1945. The street fighting was intense. It was often impossible to tell soldiers from civilians. Sometimes the victims caught in the crossfire were entirely innocent.
By this time, we had a new T-26. And the T-26, it was so far ahead of the old Shermans, it was unbelievable. This German tank that was sitting right in front of the Cologne Cathedral had knocked out a number of our tanks and just causing havoc. They had control over that whole area.
Bates followed the tank into battle and, scrambling for position, got this great footage of armored combat.
I heard our T-26 coming up. The first shot went in and cut the legs off of the tank commander and the Tiger. And in the film, you can see the armor-piercing shell going through the bottom of the picture. And immediately, the driver and the bow gunner, they climbed out. But the second shot, shrapnel had gotten them, too. The concussion from that 90-millimeter gun is so tremendous that it would just blow me off my picture, and I'd have to get back on it again. I couldn't use a tripod, of course. I had to handhold it. The tank commander that had his legs cut off, of course, just laid on top of his tank and burned up right in front of the camera. That thing was burning even the next morning. After it was all over, there was still smoke coming out of it because it had so much ammunition and whatnot in it.
2 months and 1 day later, the war in Europe was over.
Okay. I'm going to show one more clip and then we'll call it a class. This is some footage I just found recently, and this was probably shot by Jim Bates. There's a website called Critical Past, and they sell, even though this is public domain, they repackage it and they sell different historical footage, many newsreel footage and other things. And they had footage that was shot of General Rose at the steps of the Cologne Cathedral, motion picture film, the same time that Jim shot the still photo. But it's an interesting photo, or interesting film. So let me go ahead and get that up. To share screen again. It's silent. And they have their watermark over it because they allow you to download it, but they want you to buy it so that if you're downloading it to show it. But This is the color footage. I'm sorry, this isn't the Cologne Cathedral. I'll show that. But this is his boss. This is General Collins, General Lawton, Joseph Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe Collins. He's the one that said that General Rose shortened the war by 5 to 6 months. And there's General Rose in color footage. But this is real brief, so I'll show this. That's the end of the footage there. And let me show you the Cologne Cathedral footage. And like I said, this had to be shot by Jim Bates because he was there, unless there's another combat photographer that was shooting film at the time. No, there's some other footage to start, so I have to get to the point of the Cologne. Yeah, there's a Cologne Cathedral. But they're at the foot of the Cologne Cathedral. It's General Rose and the guy who replaced him. When he was killed in action, they turned over the 3rd Armored Division to General Doyle Hickey. And he's the short guy, well, compared to the general. The general was about 6'1", but he's a short guy standing next to the general, a little heavy set, but a big smile on his face. Where the general, of course, has always had that steely gaze. But there's Doyle Hickey. He's in the center, and he's smiling. They're celebrating the fact that they defeated Nazis in Cologne. But General Rose, there's almost a grin on his face. It's the closest I've seen of a smile when you see the close-up of him. And Jim must have been out of the frame because he was right there when this was happening. See, he's almost smiling. There's almost a smile, not there. There's Doyle Hickey. But there's a lot of footage. If someone decided to do a professional documentary, there's a lot of footage, film footage, and in the collection of Marshall Fogel, the still photos of Rose as a child growing up in Denver. There's a lot of material there to do a great story on him. There he is, just 3 weeks before his death. But anyway, if anybody had any more questions, I think we're about 5 minutes to the second hour.
Anybody have any questions? Go ahead and unmute yourself if you do.
Just one quick comment. When I mentioned to Mike I was going to take this class, Mike said, "Oh, I've landed at the Maurice Rose Airfield in Frankfurt, Germany."
Oh, nice. Yeah, there are a few things named after him.
Yeah, military airfield. It's closed now, so.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the 3rd Armored Division went into mothballs after the Gulf War, 1996 or 1997. I can't remember, but I don't think the 3rd Armored Division is still operating. But yeah, there was a troop ship named after him. Of course, it's the Rose Hospital. There's another building in his birthplace of Connecticut. There's a town of Connecticut. Where was it? Middleton, Connecticut. But there's another book coming out in May. It's written by a general who was in the Gulf War, brigadier general, and the book is being published in May, and it's going to be coming out with an audio book. And I forget the man's name. If you want to email me, I can send you the link. But he wrote a book on General Rose, and I suspect it's going to be very good, based on his military background. And there's a lot of interest now, certainly in the Denver Jewish community. There's with the sculpture being built, they want to try and get some funding for it, and hopefully the word is spreading. I'm doing these programs. I gave one to the Public Historical Society. I'm certainly open to give more programs on General Rose, and hopefully we're getting the word out.